Hi everyone. I'll be talking you through our mapping 102. We'll be talking about the window of discourse and so on. As you may have recalled from previous sessions, we've moved now from point of view into listening model, and you've all identified narrative communities, and some of you are in the process of analyzing the language as well as mapping. And so today we'll be discussing the window of discourse as it relates to narrative mapping as we move towards starting the reframe and also thinking about what can potentially change about your research. Next slide, please. Okay, thanks. So as you may recall from the previous session, Fede introduced some of the narrative communities from the territories of transition hack. Here we have three main ones. The hegemonic one here is the private property narrative community, where the plot to convert the land into merchandise and individual ownership is the main motive. In the TOT land, the example, the land back community is our catalytic one because they had network support and influence within the narrative space around the topic of land. And then on the right, we can see the back to the land community, which is also alternative or catalytic. And the goal of this community was to be more grounded in relationship with the land, territory, and the body, as well as the spirit. And this one is what we refer to later as the cura da terra. Andrea will be fully walking us through an example of this community in relation to the window of discourse. Okay, so the catalytic community, our land back community description here is just to essentially recover the land within an institutional framework, which also includes the restoration of relationships, governance structures, and cultural practices. So as such, we can see with this community, this is the community that we most want to hack in order to shift the window of discourse. The narrative objective here was to engage the audience, which is our activist groups in the Americas within the land back narrative community, in conversations about our relationship with the land, so our ontology, and expanding the conversation beyond ownership of land, which is the justice axis, and therefore pushing the window of discourse towards a deeper ontological shift, which would be our justice and onto shift. So, as you may recall from the previous session, the communities that are seated towards the bottom left quadrant are those that tend to be rooted in structures of oppression. So in this case, a private property hegemonic community, which is quite large and informal and influential in the narrative space, which you can see by the size on the mapping. And then we have the land back community, which is seated towards the middle, but within the quadrant of justice and reform, which is the land back one, because it's seeking to reform through more conventional knowledge and structures, while also leaning a little bit more towards invoking cultural practices. It's relatively less influential, as can be seen by the size compared to the private property narrative community. And then finally, in the top right quadrant, we have the back to land community, which is situated near the top as it's more in the quadrant of justice and onto shift. And it's combined in transformative systems with plural ways of knowing and being. So it's a much smaller community with less influence and power. So essentially, the window of discourse, which we'll be showing you in the next slide, is a descriptive model for understanding how ideas in society change over time and influence politics. It describes a wide range of political ideas that are seemed acceptable to the public. Another term for the window of discourse is the Overton window, which is a term that's been coined by libertarian Joseph Overton in the 1990s. The window is always shifting and moving, and social movements are able to then shift what lies inside or outside of the window. Over time, various ideas that were once unthinkable, such as queer rights, abolition, suffrage, or land back, can become widely acknowledged and accepted, or even institutionalized. So ideas within the window are more accepted as popular or common sense. Ideas on the edge of the window are considered more radical or controversial, and ideas outside of the window are considered unthinkable and thus treated as absurd or threatening. The window discourse often gravitates towards the most influential communities in the narrative space. It's more relative to the cultural context, as is defined by your point of view, and it's also another tool that we use for defining what can change. So here you can see an example of the window of discourse, which is seated more towards the bottom left quadrant of the map, which encompasses this private property community we've spoken about, while the land back community is more on the edge of the window because it's framed as a more radical or controversial community. The goal here is to engage the activists in the land back community, which is our catalytic community, in order to shift this window of discourse closer to the top right-hand quadrant where the back to land community is seated. So Fede will be talking us through the social tipping points, which we'll be referring to in a moment.
So you have already see how your mapping can start to tell us, like what are the fringes of what is actually understood as common sense in your narrative space, right? And when we talk about the social tipping points, we refer to the phenomenon when a social system crosses a crucial threshold, which is actually the borders of your window of discourse. And often this is due to the influence of a minority group reaching a critical mass. We map this through the changes in the window of discourse, which make the radical common sense. And that is what we call the culture hacking. But specifically, what do we mean by social tipping points? So there has been interesting research in social areas that actually tell us that committed minorities can induce sweeping social change, underscoring the effects of social influence and group decision-making on societal norms and conventions. And these were two different studies that were done by these guys, Centola, Becker, and Skrinsvan. I don't know how it's named. But what they found in the researches was the first one that when a group of people started to get influenced and reached the 25% of the group, then some of the social behaviors started to change in the whole group, right? And that's another thing that was also found with the 10%. So what we used in Culture Hack is between the 10 and the 25% is what we call the catalytic capacity of narrative communities to actually create cultural change in this specific social system. So the important thing to understand here is that it is very important that we start to define the scale of our hack, right? What is the capacity that our organization has to actually create these catalytic communities that can promote change, right? Are we talking about a very local change, which could be, for example, to change a narrative in an organization of 100 people, right? So maybe my target then will be around 24 people. Okay, that feels achievable in a very small area. And again, as we have showed in previous, there is no small change, right? Like as we grow this process, we can go then maybe to a national process or a regional process. So to promote a change in political perception in a country, we might have to target, depending, of course, in the country size, between 5 and 10 million people. That's a lot more than when we talk about local or hyper-local, right? But then when we talk about global, that's when it is very important for us to acknowledge if our movement has actually the capacity to reach this, or if what we need to do is create coalitions of movements that can help us do this change. So to a global change, for example, to tackle climate change, we know that we need roughly, or at least 1 billion people changing their behavior and changing their way of thinking about a specific way, right? So the tipping points will help us kind of clarify what is possible to change in our existing narrative space. So to do that, we have actually these four different possibilities of change that you can already start describing in your specific hacks, right? So what can change in the narrative space? For example, we can talk about the tipping point, right? What is the scale of your hack? Where is that 10 to 25% critical mass that you want to work with? Where can you actually start creating that catalytic capacity? Then we have the window of discourse. What is the intended shift in the window? What are the new common sense that can push toward systems change, right? So once you have already a snapshot of your existing map, where can you actually move the window of discourse? Then we can also use the attention network and power. So we can describe how will the existing communities evolve if this change starts to happen. So what will be the measurable attention network and power change in those communities? Is any specific community getting more attention? Is the network changing in one of the communities so that the space can change? Or is the power rebalancing in this narrative space, right? And finally, we can also describe the change through frames and metaphors. So what is the language of narrative change? What are the frames and metaphors that can leverage cultural evolution in our existing narrative space? So now you start maybe to understand why we did this very in-depth research into the narrative communities, so that we can actually describe what is actually possible to change in this narrative. And I'm going to share the voice to Tiffany, that is going to tell us a little bit more in a specific example about this.
Thanks so much, Fede. So yeah, I'm going to bring in the post-capitalist philanthropy example again, which we've been seeding throughout these last calls. And this is specifically looking at wealth as a transition pathway beyond the meta crisis. And the scale, like what Fede was talking about here, is the philanthropic sector globally. And if you move to the next slide, I'm going to jump straight into the mapping and the window of discourse. And just to echo Melandri's introduction of the window of discourse, so you really start to digest this concept. It's really a tool to help us understand how ideas change in society and how these ideas, which tend to be packaged up in the form of narratives and stories, they define what is seen as acceptable. And what is in the window is the common sense of a given culture or a public conversation. And what is not in the window is really not so popular in the mainstream conversation. And the window is always moving. And as narrative practitioners, which we all are, we're aiming to move this window. And ideally, in the culture hack method, using this mapping now that you're all getting to know and acquainted with, is that we want to shift the window towards the top right quadrant, where this is where justice plus ontological shift is. And shifting it is essentially making the radical become common sense. So in relation to this example of post-capitalist philanthropy, in the realm of the sector of philanthropy, we found that the window of discourse has actually shifted already from community A, which is the business as usual community, and this is very much traditional philanthropy, the Jeff Bezos types, which are very much embedded within the capitalist system, focusing on symptoms. So we're actually seeing the window of discourse is not there. It's shifted a little bit to where communities B, C, and D sit. And B is about systems change. So very much in the mainstream discourse in the philanthropic sector, we're really seeing people talk about root causes. Even if they're still embedded in growth, profit-oriented paradigms, we're looking at a shift from symptoms to root causes. And we're also seeing in the window of discourse, lots of discussion about decolonization. So C is decolonization, D is a kind of offshoot of that, is reparations. I won't go into the minute details of difference between them, but essentially the takeaway here is these discourses are growing much more popular, especially after decolonization became a bit of a buzzword or a fashion in philanthropy. Whether this is actually really embedded in material change or not, it very much kind of saturated the philanthropic sector. And we saw, especially after the pandemic and the Black Lives Matter protests that were triggered by the George Floyd murder, here there was a lot of talk about decolonization. So once upon a time, decolonization was more at the fringe, and then it kind of entered into this mainstream. And just quickly to talk about Community E, which is the new custodians, you see it up the y-axis. This is a narrative promoting the release of wealth into the hands of the new custodians. So these are the communities themselves, like unblocking capital, letting it flow, giving it to the communities who really understand how they're going to then redistribute the wealth themselves. And F is the kind of most reimagining wealth community, which is about completely thinking about wealth beyond its market definition, thinking about wealth as, say, access to water, seed varieties, elder knowledge, and so on. And here you can see that we want to shift the window of discourse. As you can imagine, eventually we want to shift it all the way to the top right quadrant to achieve not only justice in philanthropy, which is very much the redistribution of wealth as we see in Community E, but also an ontological shift in philanthropy. So this is where ontologies, or the very ways that we perceive the world, this changes too. So our very definition of wealth changes. So the top right is the justice plus onto shift space. So imagine if that became philanthropic common sense. So yeah, as you can see in this slide, just to summarize, the window of discourse is not only a descriptive tool, which shows us where the popular discourse lies, where the mainstream conversation lies. Quite nicely, you can map that onto your mapping graph that you did. But also the window of discourse, we use it as a prescriptive tool. So it can help us think about where we want to shift the window of discourse, where we want to shift the public conversation. We're starting to think about narrative strategy here. So in other words, we really want to populate the top right quadrant with new narratives and shift the discourse up there. And importantly, on the next slide, we want to talk to you about step-by-step strategies, step-by-step systems change. So you really can't jump straight to the top right-hand quadrant in the first intervention or narrative hack. You really can't just make the radical common sense in the first hack. What you really need is a step-by-step strategy that can get us there. And while we see this top right quadrant as a kind of guiding star or guiding strategy, we recognize that change is something that really happens in stages. And so we want to create a trajectory which can help us see the bigger picture. And here, if you move to the next slide, in the mapping, we tend to call these steps vectors at Culture Hack. And in relation to post-capitalist philanthropy, if we move to the next slide, you can see that we have a 3-step process here of how to shift the window of discourse. And vector 1 is, in the next slide, is all about transition from systems change to decolonization and reparation. So here we want to kind of propel these discussions about root cause to kind of move to some kind of logical conclusions about really actually having to decolonize the material structure of philanthropy. And then if we move to the next slide, we see vector 2, which is moving from it's a structural evolution towards liberation. So here, communities are moving upward along the control versus liberation axes as philanthropy shifts away from control and centralization of wealth towards structures that decentralize wealth. And we'd like to see these shifts of the communities C and D, the decolonization communities, move towards the new custodians, where wealth is really, power is redistributed, wealth is very much in the hands of the communities to then redistribute it themselves. And then vector 3 is an ontological shift towards regenerative wealth. So here you can see that maybe on the more radical fringes of community E, the new custodians, we want to move it along to have a more ontological shift so wealth can be reimagined. And this offers inspiration for maybe gestures towards what post-capitalist philanthropy might look like. So here again, just to summarize, we have these kind of step-by-step movement across the mapping sphere that enables us to shift the window of discourse. So on the next slide, just wanted to sum up briefly what Melandri and Fede and I have been sharing, is that we want you to start thinking about where is your window of discourse and where do you want to shift it? In other words, where you want to make the radical common sense. And secondly, social tipping points happen when a small committed minority saturates key networks, which are specific audiences, which we're going to start thinking about in the next session in 2 weeks, with aligned frames, triggering a cascade that shifts the window of discourse. And finally, as I was just saying, we cannot just make the radical common sense in one hack. What we need to do is create a step-by-step strategy. And I'm going to seed this concept now. So just take it, but park it. We're going to come back to it in Costa Rica. But we actually call this stuff, this step-by-step moving between vectors, we call them transition pathways. But we're going to go into that another time. So just lodging that in your minds.